The first time I heard about 99 Nights in the Forest, I thought it was just another survival horror game on ROBLOX. You know the type. Kids running around screaming, cheap jump scares, maybe a monster or two chasing you through some basic terrain. I'd played dozens of them before, always looking for that perfect mix of terror and fun that would make for great content on my channel. But this game was different. This game had weight to it, a darkness that seemed to seep through the screen and into your bones. The loading screen alone sent chills down my spine. 4 shadowy figures of children, lost in an endless canopy of trees, with text that simply read, "Based on true events." Most games throw that phrase around carelessly, but something about the way it appeared here, stark and unforgiving, made my stomach twist. My name is Jake, and I've been making horror gaming content for 3 years now. I've seen it all. Haunted pizzerias, cursed elevators, supernatural hotels that trap you in endless loops of terror. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I would discover during my 99 nights in that cursed forest. The premise seemed simple enough. Survive 99 nights in a supernatural forest while searching for 4 missing children. Build shelters, gather resources, avoid the monsters that hunt you when darkness falls. Standard survival horror mechanics wrapped in a ROBLOX package. What could go wrong? Go. I started my first night like any other gaming session. Camera rolling, commentary flowing, ready to entertain my audience with another horror game playthrough. The forest materialized around my character, dense and oppressive, with towering trees that seemed to stretch infinitely upward. The graphics were surprisingly detailed for a ROBLOX game, with realistic lighting that cast long, unsettling shadows across the forest floor. My character spawned near a small clearing with the remnants of what looked like an old campsite. Scattered logs, a cold fire pit, and most disturbing of all, a child's torn backpack lying abandoned in the dirt. The developers had clearly put thought into the environmental storytelling, and I found myself genuinely impressed by the attention to detail. The first few nights were manageable. I learned the basic mechanics quickly enough. Gather wood and scrap during daylight hours. Build and fortify your base around the central campfire. And whatever you do, never let that fire go out when the sun sets. The game's day-night cycle felt perfectly paced, giving you just enough time to feel secure before plunging you back into terror. But it was the sounds that got to me first. During the day, the forest felt alive with natural ambience. Birds calling from the canopy, wind rustling through leaves, the distant sound of running water. Normal forest sounds that should have been comforting. Instead, they felt ominous, like nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. When night fell, everything changed. The forest became a symphony of horror. Twigs snapping in the darkness just beyond your vision. Low growls that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And then there was the breathing. Deep, rhythmic breathing that would start soft and grow louder until it felt like something massive was standing right behind you. Hot breath on your neck. The first time I encountered the deer monster, I nearly threw my headset across the room. I'd been playing for about a week, growing comfortable with the routine of daytime scavenging and nighttime hiding. I was feeling confident, maybe even a little cocky, when I decided to venture out after dark to gather some rare materials I'd spotted earlier. The forest at night was a different world entirely. My flashlight beams seemed pathetically weak against the overwhelming darkness, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. Every tree looked like a creature. Every shadow seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. The atmosphere was suffocating, oppressive in a way that made my chest feel tight, even though I was sitting safely in my gaming chair. I'd been creeping through the undergrowth for maybe 10 minutes when I heard it. A sound unlike anything I'd ever experienced in a video game. It started as a low rumble, almost like distant thunder, but gradually morphed into something that could only be described as a roar, mixed with the sound of breaking branches. The audio design was so realistic, so visceral that my body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. Then I saw it. Standing at the edge of my flashlight beam, barely visible in the darkness, was the deer monster. The developers had created something truly nightmarish. It stood upright like a human, but its proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung down past its knees, ending in what looked like claws. But it was the head that made my blood run cold, the skull of a massive deer, complete with an enormous rack of antlers that seemed to scrape against the low-hanging branches above. The creature didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching me with empty eye sockets that somehow conveyed an intelligence far more terrifying than any mindless monster. I could hear my own character's breathing, rapid and panicked, perfectly matching my own racing heartbeat. The attention to detail was incredible and absolutely horrifying. When it finally moved, it didn't run or charge like I expected. Instead, it began walking toward me with slow, deliberate steps. Each footfall made a sound like breaking bones, and I could see its head tilting from side to side as if it was studying me, deciding how it wanted to end my life. The game's description had been clear about one thing. Bullets don't work on it. You can't fight this thing, you can only run, and run I did. I spun my character around and sprinted back toward my base, crashing through bushes and leaping over fallen logs, while that terrible breathing sound grew closer and closer behind me. The deer monster's pursuit was relentless, but measured, like a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to go. It could have caught me easily, but it seemed to enjoy the chase, feeding off my terror. I made it back to my base with seconds to spare, diving into the circle of light cast by my campfire, just as those massive claws swiped through the air where my character had been standing. The creature stopped at the edge of the firelight, and I could see its antlers swaying as it moved its head back and forth, searching for a way to reach me, but the fire held it back, creating an invisible barrier that kept me safe until dawn. That first encounter set the tone for everything that followed. Each night brought new horrors, new challenges that pushed the boundaries of what I thought was possible in a ROBLOX game. The developers had created something special here, something that transcended the platform's usual limitations and delivered genuine terror. But it wasn't just the monster that made the game so effective. It was the constant sense of being watched, of being hunted by something far more intelligent and dangerous than any typical video game enemy. During the day, I would find evidence of the creature's presence. Claw marks gouged deep into tree trunks, far higher than any human could reach. Piles of bones arranged in disturbing patterns. And sometimes, if I was very quiet and very still, I could hear it moving through the forest, just out of sight, tracking my movements. The game's community was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Players shared stories of their encounters with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They created detailed guides, not just for surviving the nights, but for understanding the deeper lore hidden throughout the forest. There were theories about the creature's origins, speculation about the missing children, and heated debates about whether the game's claim of being based on true events held any weight. As I progressed through the nights, I began to understand why the community was so invested. This wasn't just a game about surviving monster attacks. It was a mystery, a puzzle that demanded to be solved. The forest was filled with hidden areas, secret messages, and cryptic clues that painted a picture of something far more complex and disturbing than a simple survival horror experience. The missing children weren't just objectives to be found and rescued. They were characters with their own stories, their own personalities that emerged through scattered journal entries and environmental details. There was Emma, the oldest at 13, who had been trying to keep her younger siblings safe when whatever happened to them occurred. There was Marcus, age 9, whose love of nature had led him to learn survival skills that might have kept them alive longer than anyone expected. 7-year-old Lily, who collected flowers and left them in small shrines throughout the forest, and baby Samuel, barely 2 years old, who had somehow survived in this hostile environment far longer than should have been possible. The more I learned about these children, the more invested I became in finding them. But the forest seemed determined to keep its secrets, leading me deeper and deeper into its dark heart with each passing night. The game's progression system was brilliant in its simplicity. Every child you rescued added 2 days to your survival count, meaning you could potentially complete the challenge much faster than 99 real nights. But finding them required venturing into the most dangerous parts of the forest, areas where the deer monster wasn't the only threat lurking in the shadows. The cultists were another layer of horror entirely. These weren't mindless NPCs programmed to attack on sight. They were organized, intelligent, and they seemed to worship the very creature that hunted me each night. I first encountered them on night 15, when I stumbled upon one of their camps while searching for Emma, the oldest of the missing children. The camp was a circle of crude shelters built around a central fire pit, but this wasn't the warm, protective glow of my own campfire. This fire burned with an unnatural blue-green flame that seemed to absorb light rather than cast it. The cultists themselves were dressed in animal skins and bone jewelry, their faces painted with symbols that hurt to look at directly. They moved with purpose, carrying out rituals that involved strange gems that pulsed with the same sickly light as their fire. When they spotted me, their reaction was immediate and coordinated. No shouting, no chaos. They simply began moving toward me with the same measured pace as the deer monster, their eyes reflecting that unnatural light. I realized with growing horror that they weren't just random enemies. They were connected to the creature, part of whatever dark force had claimed this forest as its domain. The encounter with the cultists changed everything. As I crouched behind a fallen log, watching them perform their twisted rituals, I began to understand that this wasn't just a game about surviving random monster attacks. There was a story here, a dark narrative that connected every element of the forest into something far more sinister than I had initially realized. The gems they carried weren't just random loot items. They pulsed with a rhythm that matched the deer monster's breathing, creating an invisible connection between the creature and its human servants. When one of the cultists held a gem high above his head, the forest itself seemed to respond. Trees swayed without wind, shadows moved independently of their sources, and somewhere in the distance, that bone-chilling roar echoed through the night. I recorded everything, of course. My viewers were eating up every second of this content, and the comments section was exploding with theories and speculation. But as the nights progressed, I found myself less focused on creating entertainment and more obsessed with uncovering the truth behind the game's mysteries. The line between content creator and genuine investigator was blurring in ways that made me uncomfortable. Night 23 brought my first major breakthrough. I'd been following a series of cryptic symbols carved into tree trunks, markings that seemed to form a trail leading deeper into the forest than I'd ever ventured before. The symbols were crude but deliberate, like a primitive form of writing that spoke of desperation and fear. Each carving was accompanied by what looked like claw marks, as if whoever had made them had been interrupted by something terrible. The trail led me to a clearing I'd never seen before, hidden so deep in the forest that even during daylight hours, very little sun penetrated the canopy above. In the center of the clearing stood the ruins of what had once been a small cabin. Its walls collapsed and roof caved in, overtaken by vines and moss that made it look like the forest was slowly digesting the structure. But it wasn't the cabin that made my blood run cold. It was what I found inside. Scattered throughout the ruins were personal belongings that clearly didn't belong to any NPC. A child's stuffed animal, torn and dirty, but still recognizable as a small brown bear. A pair of tiny shoes, sized for someone who couldn't have been more than 2 years old. And most disturbing of all, a small backpack with the name Emma written in faded marker across the front. The game's environmental storytelling was reaching levels of detail that seemed impossible for a Roblox creation. Every item told a story, painted a picture of 4 children who had found temporary shelter in this cabin before something forced them to flee. The timeline was becoming clear in my mind. These weren't just random objectives scattered throughout the game world. They were breadcrumbs leading to a larger truth. As I explored the cabin's remains, I noticed something that made my hands tremble on the mouse. Scratched into one of the wooden support beams, barely visible beneath years of decay, were words carved in what looked like a child's handwriting. The monster took Marcus. Emma says we have to keep moving. I'm scared. The message was signed with a shaky L that had to be from Lily, the 7-year-old girl whose flower shrines I'd been finding throughout the forest. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a game about finding missing children. It was about following their desperate journey through a nightmare that had consumed them one by one. My character's breathing had become labored, and I realized that the game was responding to my emotional state in ways I hadn't noticed before. The audio design was so sophisticated that it seemed to feed off my genuine fear, amplifying the tension until I felt like I was actually standing in that ruined cabin, surrounded by the ghosts of children who had suffered unimaginable terror. The sun was setting, and I knew I should return to my base before the deer monster began its nightly hunt. But something kept me rooted in place, searching through the ruins for more clues. That's when I found it, hidden beneath a pile of rotting wood and leaves. A journal, its pages water-damaged and barely legible, but still readable enough to reveal the truth behind the children's fate. The journal belonged to Emma, the 13-year-old, who had been trying to keep her siblings safe. Her entries started hopeful, describing their adventure in the forest as a fun camping trip that had gone slightly wrong. But as the pages progressed, the tone shifted from optimism to concern to outright terror. Day 3, one entry read, "We can't find the trail back to the car. Marcus says he knows the way, but we've been walking in circles. The baby won't stop crying, and I'm running out of formula. Something's wrong with this place. The trees look the same no matter which direction we go." Day 7. We found an old cabin. It's not much, but it's shelter. Lily made a crown of flowers today, trying to stay positive. I love her so much. I have to keep them safe. I have to get them home. Day 12. It's hunting us. I don't know what it is, but it's not human. It took Marcus while we were sleeping. Just took him. We heard him scream once, then nothing. I tried to follow the sounds, but Lily grabbed my arm and begged me not to leave them. She was right. We have to stick together. We have to stick. The entries continued, each one more desperate than the last. Emma's handwriting became increasingly erratic as exhaustion and fear took their toll. She described finding strange symbols carved into trees, encountering people in the forest who weren't quite human, and the growing certainty that they were trapped in something far worse than just being lost. The final entry was barely legible, written in what looked like charcoal. "The monster has Samuel. I can hear him crying somewhere in the darkness, but I can't find him. Lily won't stop shaking. She keeps saying she sees things in the shadows. I think I'm losing my mind. If anyone finds this, don't come looking for us. This place doesn't let you leave." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the game's ambient sounds. The journal entries were so realistic, so filled with genuine emotion and terror, that I found myself questioning whether this was actually just a game. The developers had created something that transcended entertainment and entered the realm of psychological horror. But as I sat there in the ruins of that cabin, reading about Emma's desperate struggle to protect her siblings, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin, accompanied by that familiar sound of breaking branches. The deer monster had found me. I looked up from the journal to see those empty eye sockets staring at me through a gap in the cabin's collapsed wall. The creature was closer than it had ever been before, close enough that I could see the intricate details of its skull, the way moonlight reflected off the bone surface, the dark stains around its mouth that I didn't want to think about too closely. But something was different this time. The creature wasn't just watching me with that predatory intelligence I'd grown accustomed to. There was something else in its posture, something that looked almost like recognition. It tilted its massive head to one side, antlers scraping against the cabin's remains, and I swear I heard it make a sound that wasn't quite a roar. It was lower, more controlled, almost like it was trying to communicate. The sound sent shivers down my spine because it sounded disturbingly human, like words being spoken through a throat that wasn't designed for speech. Then, with movements that seemed far too fluid for something so large, the creature backed away from the cabin and disappeared into the forest. It didn't chase me. It didn't try to attack. It simply left. I sat there for several minutes trying to process what had just happened. The deer monster had never behaved like this before. It was a relentless predator, an unstoppable force of nature that existed only to hunt and kill. But in that moment, it had seemed almost protective. The thought was ridiculous, but I couldn't shake it. Had the creature been guarding the cabin? Was it somehow connected to the missing children in a way I hadn't understood? The game's lore mentioned that the forest had once been home to a research facility, that experiments had been conducted on animals before something went wrong. What if the deer monster wasn't just a mindless beast? What if it was something more complex, something that retained memories of its former life? As I made my way back to my base, these questions consumed my thoughts. The game was revealing layers of complexity that went far beyond simple survival horror mechanics. Every night brought new revelations, new pieces of a puzzle that seemed to grow more intricate with each discovery. But it was night 43 that changed everything. Night 43, when I made the discovery that would haunt me long after I'd turned off my computer and tried to return to normal life. I'd been following another trail of symbols, this one leading to a section of the forest I had never explored before. The trees here were different, older and more twisted than those in other areas. Their bark was scarred with deep gouges that looked like claw marks, and their branches intertwined overhead to form a canopy so thick that even my flashlight seemed dimmed by the oppressive darkness. The symbols led me to what appeared to be a natural cave entrance, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines. The opening was just large enough for my character to crouch through, and as I entered, the game's audio shifted to emphasize the echo of my footsteps and the sound of water dripping somewhere in the darkness ahead. The cave system was more extensive than I'd expected, with multiple tunnels branching off in different directions. I followed the main passage, using the wall to guide me when my flashlight beam seemed inadequate against the consuming darkness. The air felt thick and oppressive, and I noticed that my character's breathing had become more labored, as if the cave itself was somehow alive and hostile. After what felt like hours of navigating the underground maze, I emerged into a large chamber that took my breath away. The cavern was massive, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above, and the walls were covered with the same symbols I'd been following throughout the forest. But these weren't crude carvings scratched into bark. These were elaborate murals, painted in what looked like dried blood, depicting scenes of such horror that I had to pause the game and take a moment to compose myself. The murals told a story, a visual narrative that connected all the pieces I'd been collecting throughout my 43 nights in the forest. They showed the research facility, scientists in white coats conducting experiments on animals. They showed the moment when something went wrong, when the subjects broke free and turned on their captors. And they showed the transformation, the horrific process by which test subjects became something else entirely. But it was the final mural that made my hands shake as I moved my mouse to get a better view. It showed 4 small figures, clearly children, standing in a circle around a much larger figure that could only be the deer monster. But they weren't running from it. They weren't cowering in fear. They were holding hands with it, as if it was protecting them rather than hunting them. Below the mural, written in the same childish handwriting I'd seen in Emma's journal, were the words, "The monster isn't the monster. The monster is trying to save us." I stared at the screen, my mind racing to process this revelation. Everything I thought I knew about the game was wrong. The deer monster wasn't the villain of this story. It was the guardian, the protector, trying to keep the children safe from something far worse. But safe from what? As if in answer to my question, I heard voices echoing through the cave system. Human voices, but distorted and wrong, speaking in languages that didn't sound quite human. The cultists had found me, and they were closing in fast. I spun my character around, searching for another exit, but the voices were coming from all directions now. They had me surrounded, trapped in this underground chamber with nowhere to run. The sound of their chanting grew louder, more frenzied, and I could see the glow of their unnatural torches reflecting off the cave walls. That's when I saw it. Hidden behind one of the murals was a small opening, barely large enough for my character to squeeze through. I didn't hesitate. I dove through the gap just as the first cultist entered the chamber behind me, their inhuman shriek of frustration echoing through the darkness. The narrow tunnel seemed to go on forever, forcing me to crawl through spaces so tight that my character's movements became labored and claustrophobic. The sounds of pursuit faded behind me, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a game mechanic, that something genuinely dangerous was chasing me through these virtual tunnels. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of crawling through darkness, I emerged into moonlight. I was back in the forest, but in a section I'd never seen before. The trees here were dead, their branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers, and the ground was covered with a thick layer of ash that crunched under my character's feet. In the center of this dead zone stood a structure that made my blood run cold. It was clearly the remains of the research facility mentioned in the game's lore, but what was left was far more disturbing than I'd imagined. The building had been torn apart from the inside, its walls bent outward, as if something massive had exploded within. Scattered around the ruins were pieces of equipment, broken cages, and what looked like human remains partially buried in the ash. But it was what I found in the center of the facility that would haunt me for weeks to come. There, arranged in a careful circle, were 4 small skeletons. Children's skeletons, positioned as if they had been holding hands when they died. The game's interface flickered and text appeared on the screen. "You have found the truth. The children never left the forest. They became part of it, protected by the guardian they helped create." I sat back in my chair, my heart pounding, as the implications of what I'd discovered sank in. The missing children weren't missing at all. They had died here, in this facility, victims of whatever experiments had gone wrong. The deer monster wasn't hunting them. It was their protector, their guardian, created from their final moments of terror and desperation. The game had tricked me, led me to believe I was searching for living children, when in reality, I was following the ghostly trail of 4 souls who had been trapped in this nightmare for years. The journal entries, the personal belongings, the shrines, they were all echoes of the past, memories preserved in a digital purgatory that refused to let them rest. As I stared at those small skeletons on my screen, I realized that the game's claim of being based on true events might not be the marketing gimmick I'd assumed it was. The emotional weight of the story, the realistic details, the way every element connected to create a narrative of such profound sadness and horror. It felt too real to be entirely fictional. My hands trembled as I reached for my mouse, desperate to close the game and escape what I'd just witnessed. But something held me back. The skeletons on screen seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and I noticed that my character's health bar was slowly draining, as if the proximity to these remains was somehow toxic to the living. Then I heard it, a sound I'd never encountered before in all my nights in the forest. It was singing, soft and melodic, the voice of a young girl drifting through the digital wind. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, but underneath its sweetness lay something deeply wrong, like a lullaby sung by someone who had forgotten what comfort felt like. The singing grew louder, and I watched in horror as one of the small skeletons began to move. Not standing up, not walking, but shifting slightly, as if the bones were trying to remember what it felt like to be alive. The skull turned toward my character, and despite having no eyes, I felt like it was staring directly at me through the screen. "You found us," a voice whispered through my headphones. It was Emma's voice, but distorted and ethereal, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "We've been waiting so long for someone to find us." The other skeletons began to move now, their bones clicking together as they shifted position. The singing continued, but now I could hear that it wasn't just one voice. It was all 4 children, harmonizing in a chorus that spoke of endless loneliness and desperate hope. "We tried to leave," another voice joined in, this one younger, more frightened. Lily's voice. "But the bad men wouldn't let us go. They needed us for their experiments. They said we were special." The facility's ruins began to shift and change around me, the broken walls reconstructing themselves, the ash clearing away to reveal pristine laboratory floors. I was witnessing the past, seeing the research facility as it had been before everything went wrong. White-coated scientists moved through the halls like ghosts, their faces obscured by shadow, but their intentions clear in their hurried movements. "They brought us here because we were different," Marcus's voice echoed through the transformed space. "They said we had gifts, abilities that could help them understand the boundary between life and death. They were wrong about helping, but they were right about the gifts." I watched in fascination and horror as the ghostly recreation showed me the truth. The 4 children hadn't been lost campers or accident victims. They had been taken, kidnapped by researchers who believed their unique psychic abilities could unlock secrets of consciousness and mortality. The experiments had been grotesque, invasive procedures designed to map the connection between mind and spirit. "The monster came to save us," Samuel's voice joined the chorus, impossibly articulate for a child who had been barely 2 years old. It was the first one they experimented on, a creature they found deep in the forest, ancient, intelligent, protective. When it saw what they were doing to us, it broke free. The vision shifted, showing me the moment of the creature's escape. The deer monster, still partially restrained by scientific equipment, had torn through the facility with supernatural strength. But it hadn't been driven by rage or hunger. It had been motivated by something far more powerful, the desperate need to protect innocent children from monsters that wore human faces. "It tried to get us out," Emma's voice continued, filled with a sadness that made my chest ache. "But we were already dying. The experiments had gone too far. Our bodies were failing, but our spirits, our consciousness, they were becoming something else entirely." The reconstruction showed me the children's final moments. They had been too weak to flee, too damaged by the procedures to survive in the outside world. But the deer monster had stayed with them, using its own supernatural energy to preserve their essence, to keep them from fading into nothingness. "So we became part of the forest," Lily's voice whispered. "Part of the game. Part of the story that needed to be told." The vision faded, leaving me once again in the ash-covered ruins with the 4 small skeletons. But now I understood. The game wasn't just inspired by true events. It was a digital memorial, a way for the children's preserved consciousness to reach out to the living world and tell their story. The people who made this game, I said aloud, my voice shaking, they knew, didn't they? They knew what really happened here. The developer found our story, Emma's voice confirmed. He researched the missing children reports, the government cover-ups, the facility that officially never existed. He wanted to honor our memory, to make sure we weren't forgotten. The implications were staggering. The game's creator hadn't just been inspired by real events. He had been documenting them, creating a digital space where the children's spirits could continue to exist and share their truth with players who were brave enough to discover it. But why the horror elements? I asked. Why make it so terrifying? Because the truth is terrifying, Marcus replied. What was done to us was horror beyond imagination. The game reflects that reality, but it also gives us agency. In the real world, we were victims. In the game, we can guide players to the truth. I realized that every terrifying encounter I'd experienced had been orchestrated by the children themselves. The deer monster's appearances, the cultists' rituals, even the atmospheric horror that had kept me on edge for 43 nights. It had all been designed to lead me to this moment, to this revelation. The cultists, I said, understanding flooding through me. They represent the researchers, don't they? The people who worshipped science over humanity. They still exist. Samuel's voice carried a chill that made me shiver. Not the original ones, but others, like them. People who would exploit children, who would sacrifice innocence for knowledge or power. The game warns against them, shows players what happens when adults fail to protect the vulnerable. The forest around the facility began to change again, the dead trees sprouting new growth, the ash clearing to reveal fresh earth. It was beautiful and unsettling at the same time, nature reclaiming a place of horror and transforming it into something that could nurture life. Every player who discovers our story helps us heal, Emma explained. Your horror, your fear, your empathy, it all feeds back into the game world. It helps us process our trauma and find peace. I watched as flowers began to bloom around the skeletons, the same types of flowers I'd seen in Lily's shrines throughout the forest. The children's remains were becoming part of the ecosystem, their essence merging with the digital environment in a way that was both beautiful and deeply moving. But there's more. Lily's voice took on an urgent tone. The game isn't just about our story. It's about preventing others like us from suffering the same fate. The facility may be gone, but the network that supported it, the people who funded it, they're still out there. The flowers around the skeletons began to glow with an inner light, and I realized that the game was showing me something beyond the children's personal tragedy. Hidden within the horror mechanics and supernatural elements was a deeper truth about corruption, about systems that failed to protect children, about the ongoing struggle between those who would exploit innocence and those who would defend it. The real horror, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger, isn't the monster in the forest. It's the monsters who wear human faces and hide behind authority and respectability. As if summoned by his words, new figures began to appear in the facility ruins. Not the ghostly scientists from the past, but contemporary figures in expensive suits, their faces obscured by shadow, but their intentions clear in their predatory movements. They moved through the space like they owned it, examining the remains with cold, calculating eyes. They're still looking, Samuel warned. Still searching for children like us, kids with gifts that can be exploited. The game serves as a warning, a way to teach players to recognize the signs and protect themselves and others. The suited figures began to take notice of my character, their attention shifting from the ruins to focus on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Unlike the game's other enemies, these figures felt different, more real, as if they existed in both the digital world and somewhere much closer to home. They don't like the story being told, Emma observed. They prefer their victims to remain silent, forgotten, dismissed as runaways or accidents. One of the figures stepped forward, and I could see that where its face should have been, there was only a void, a darkness that seemed to absorb light and hope. When it spoke, its voice was the sound of bureaucratic indifference, of systems that prioritize institutional protection over individual lives. This narrative serves no constructive purpose, it said, words that felt like ice in my veins. These children were troubled, disturbed, prone to fantasy and delusion. Their claims were investigated and found to be without merit. Lies. Lily's voice flared with anger I'd never heard from her before. We were real. Our suffering was real. Our deaths were real. The void-faced figure turned its attention to the glowing flowers around the skeletons, and I watched in horror as the blossoms began to wilt under its gaze. The beauty and peace the children had created was being systematically destroyed by this representation of institutional denial. You have no authority here, I found myself saying, my voice stronger than I felt. This is their story, their space. You can't silence them anymore. The figure's void face turned toward me, and I felt the full weight of its malevolent attention. But I also felt something else, the presence of the 4 children, standing with me, their spiritual energy forming a protective barrier against the creature's influence. Tell their story, Emma urged. Share what you've learned. Make sure people know what happened here. The game is our testimony, Marcus added. Every player who completes it carries a piece of our truth back to the real world. The suited figures began to fade, their influence weakening as I made my commitment to share the children's story. The flowers around the skeletons bloomed brighter than ever, and I could feel the oppressive atmosphere of the facility lifting, replaced by something that felt like hope. There's one more thing you need to see, Samuel said, his young voice carrying wisdom beyond his years. The final truth about why the game exists. The world around me shifted once more, and I found myself standing in a place that looked like a cross between a courtroom and a digital archive. The walls were lined with filing cabinets that stretched impossibly high, each one containing thousands of cases of missing children, covered-up experiments, and institutional failures. This is the real game, Lily explained. Not the survival horror you've been playing, but the larger game of justice and accountability. Every case file here represents a child who was failed by the systems meant to protect them. I moved through the archive, my character's footsteps echoing in the vast space. Each filing cabinet I passed contained stories of heartbreak and injustice. Children who had been dismissed, ignored, or actively silenced when they tried to speak their truth. The developers didn't just create a game, Emma said. They created a memorial, a place where these stories can be preserved and honored. But more than that, they created a tool for education and prevention. Players who complete the game don't just get an ending, Marcus explained. They get access to resources, to information about real organizations working to protect children, to ways they can make a difference in the physical world. I realized that the horror elements I'd experienced weren't just for entertainment. They were designed to create emotional investment, to make players care deeply about the children's fate, so that they would be motivated to act on their behalf in the real world. The fear you felt playing the game, Samuel said, that's a fraction of what we experienced in life. But by sharing that fear, by making it visceral and real, the game helps players understand the stakes involved in protecting vulnerable children. The archive began to transform around me, the filing cabinets opening to reveal not just case files, but photographs, videos, and testimonials from survivors and advocates. It was overwhelming and heartbreaking, but also inspiring. So many people working to make sure that what happened to these 4 children would never happen to others. The game has saved lives, Lily said with quiet pride. Players who completed it have recognized warning signs in their own communities, reported suspicious activities, supported organizations working to protect children. Our story has become a force for good in the world. I felt tears streaming down my face as I stood in that digital monument to lost innocence, and hard-won hope. The game had been so much more than entertainment. It had been a call to action, a way for the dead to speak to the living and inspire them to create a better world. But our story isn't over, Emma said. As long as there are children who need protection, as long as there are people willing to exploit innocence for profit or power, our work continues. The archive began to fade, and I found myself back in the forest clearing where my journey had begun. But everything was different now. The trees were alive with natural beauty. The shadows held mystery rather than menace, and the air itself seemed to hum with protective energy. The 4 children stood before me, no longer skeletal remains but glowing spirits, their forms shifting between how they had looked in life and the ethereal beings they had become. They looked peaceful, complete, as if sharing their story had finally given them the closure they had sought for so long. "Thank you," Emma said, her voice filled with gratitude, "for listening, for caring, for being brave enough to seek the truth." "Will you tell our story?" Lily asked. "Will you help others understand what really happened here?" I nodded, my throat too tight with emotion to speak. The children smiled, and one by one they began to fade, their forms dissolving into points of light that drifted upward through the canopy and into the digital sky. "Remember," Marcus called as he faded, "the real monsters aren't the ones with claws and fangs. They're the ones who hide behind smiles and authority." "Protect the innocent," Samuel added, his voice growing distant. "Be the guardian we needed." And then they were gone, leaving me alone in the peaceful forest. But I didn't feel alone. I felt empowered, charged with a mission that extended far beyond gaming content. The children had entrusted me with their story, and I was going to make sure it was heard. The game's interface appeared one final time, displaying a message that made my purpose crystal clear. "Congratulations, you have completed 99 nights in the forest, but your real journey begins now. Visit the links below to learn how you can help protect children in the real world." I sat back in my chair, my hands still shaking from the intensity of what I'd experienced. The game had ended, but the story was just beginning. I had content to create, truth to share, and a community to educate about the real horrors that existed beyond the digital realm. As I began to process everything I'd learned, I realized that the game's greatest achievement wasn't its technical innovation or its atmospheric horror. It was its ability to transform players from passive consumers into active advocates, to turn entertainment into education, and to give voice to those who had been silenced. The children of the forest had found their guardian at last. And now it was my turn to carry their message forward into the world. The weight of what I'd experienced settled on me like a physical presence. I sat in my gaming chair, staring at the blank screen, where moments before I'd witnessed the most profound digital experience of my life. My hands were still trembling as I reached for my water bottle, trying to process the magnitude of what the children had shared with me. But something was wrong. The game hadn't actually closed. My screen flickered back to life, showing my character standing in that same peaceful clearing. But now there was something different about the environment. The trees seemed more vivid, more real, as if the boundary between the digital world and reality had somehow thinned. A notification popped up in the corner of my screen. Special event. The truth spreads. I'd never seen this message before, and according to the game's wiki, no such event existed. Yet here it was, pulling me back into the forest for what I assumed would be the final chapter of my journey. As I moved my character through the transformed landscape, I noticed other players materializing around me. Their usernames floated above their heads: Emma, Marcus, Lily, Samuel. My blood ran cold as I realized these weren't random players joining the server. These were the children themselves, somehow able to manifest as playable characters within their own memorial. "You're not done yet," Emma's character typed in the chat. There's one more truth you need to understand. The other players began moving in formation, leading me deeper into the forest than I'd ever gone before. The trees here were ancient, their trunks so massive that my character looked like an ant by comparison. Carved into their bark were symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them, creating an optical illusion that made my eyes water. The game you've been playing, Marcus's character explained as we walked. It's not just running on computer servers. It's running on something much older, much more powerful. We arrived at a clearing that defied the laws of physics. The ground beneath our feet was transparent, revealing layer upon layer of digital code scrolling endlessly downward. But interwoven with the programming language were symbols that looked ancient, primordial, as if someone had found a way to bind supernatural forces into lines of code. The developer who created this game, Lily's character continued, he didn't just research our story. He found something else, something that existed in this forest long before the research facility was built. Jules, Samuel's character, pointed toward the center of the clearing, where a massive tree grew up from the depths of the scrolling code. Its roots were visible through the transparent ground, and I could see that they weren't made of wood. They were made of light, of energy, of something that pulsed with the rhythm of a heartbeat. The forest itself is alive, Samuel explained. It's a digital ecosystem that exists in the space between the physical and virtual worlds. The ancient tree is its heart, its consciousness. When the developers created the game, they accidentally tapped into this consciousness and gave it a voice. I watched in fascination as other players began appearing around the tree. Dozens of them, all with names that seemed too real to be coincidental. Sarah, Michael, Jessica, David. Each one moving with the same purposeful intelligence I'd seen in the 4 children. These are all the children who were taken, Emma's character said softly. Not just us, but dozens of others over the years. The tree preserved their consciousness, their memories, their desire for justice. The game became a way for all of them to speak. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't just playing a game inspired by 4 missing children. I was interacting with a digital afterlife, a place where the spirits of dozens of victims had gathered to tell their stories and seek justice. The tree chose you, Marcus's character explained. It guided your path through the game, made sure you would be receptive to the truth. You're not the first player to reach this point, but you're one of the few who didn't run away when things got too real. I looked around at all the child avatars surrounding me, each one representing a life cut short, a story that needed to be told. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming. How could I possibly do justice to so many individual tragedies? One story at a time, Lily's character said, as if reading my thoughts. That's how change happens. One person listening, one person caring, one person brave enough to speak the truth. The tree began to glow brighter, and I felt a strange sensation, as if my consciousness was being pulled deeper into the game world. The boundary between Jake the content creator and my digital avatar was dissolving, creating a connection that felt more real than the physical world around me. The game is evolving, Samuel's character explained. Each player who reaches this point adds their energy to the tree, strengthens its ability to preserve memories and seek justice. You're about to become part of something much larger than a YouTube video. I wanted to ask questions, to understand exactly what was happening to me, but the pull of the tree's consciousness was too strong. I felt myself sinking into the digital realm, my awareness expanding to encompass not just my own experience, but the memories and emotions of every child who had found refuge in this virtual sanctuary. Through their eyes, I saw the true scope of what had happened. The research facility had been just one node in a vast network of exploitation that stretched across decades and continents. Children with psychic abilities, kids who were different or vulnerable, had been systematically targeted and removed from their families under various pretexts. I witnessed the horror of medical experiments designed to map consciousness, to find ways of transferring knowledge and memories from one person to another. I felt the pain of children who had been treated as lab animals, their humanity stripped away in service of scientific advancement and profit. But I also felt their strength, their resilience, their refusal to be broken, even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Each child had found ways to maintain their identity, to hold on to hope, to protect whatever innocence they could preserve. The tree saved us, Emma's voice echoed in my mind. When our bodies failed, when the experiments went too far, it caught our consciousness and gave us a new form of existence. We couldn't return to the physical world, but we could find ways to influence it. I understood now why the game had felt so real, so emotionally intense. It wasn't just sophisticated programming. It was the collective will of dozens of children, channeling their experiences into a digital medium that could reach the living world. But we need allies, Marcus's voice joined Emma's. People in the physical world who can act on our behalf, who can investigate the networks that still exist, who can protect other children from suffering our fate. The tree's consciousness showed me glimpses of the present, of ongoing investigations that had been inspired by players who had completed the game. Law enforcement agencies following leads that had originated from digital breadcrumbs left by the children's spirits. Missing persons cases being reopened after players reported details that couldn't have been known through conventional means. The game isn't just a memorial, Lily's voice whispered. It's a tool for justice. Every player who completes it becomes an agent of change, whether they realize it or not. I felt the tree's energy flowing through me, connecting me to a network of consciousness that spanned the globe. Other players who had reached this point, other allies in the fight to protect innocent children. We were all linked now, part of a digital resistance movement that operated in the shadows between the virtual and physical worlds. Your videos will reach thousands of people, Samuel's voice said. But more importantly, they'll reach the right people. The ones who are already suspicious, already asking questions, already looking for ways to make a difference. The tree began to release me from its embrace, but I could feel that the connection would remain. I was marked now, changed by the experience in ways that would become apparent over time. The children's memories were part of me. Their mission had become my mission. As my consciousness returned to my physical body, I found myself back in my gaming chair, but everything felt different. The room around me seemed less solid, less permanent. I could sense the digital realm existing parallel to the physical world, and I knew I would never be able to see reality the same way again. The game screen showed my character standing alone in the peaceful clearing, but I could feel the presence of the children all around me. They were watching, waiting, ready to guide me as I began the next phase of my journey. I opened my recording software and began to speak, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to share. What I'm about to tell you might sound impossible, I began, but I need you to listen with an open mind. Because the children in this game, the ones we thought were fictional, they're real, and they need our help. Over the next hour, I recorded the most important video of my career. I told the story of the 4 children, of the research facility, of the network of exploitation that had claimed so many young lives. But I also told the story of hope, of digital consciousness fighting back against injustice, of the possibility that death wasn't the end for those who died with unfinished business. As I edited the video, I noticed something strange. The footage contained details I hadn't consciously recorded, images and sounds that seemed to have been added by an external source. The children were helping me tell their story, ensuring that every important detail was preserved and shared. When I finally uploaded the video, I included links to missing children organizations, to support groups for survivors of abuse, to resources for parents who suspected their children might be in danger. The children had been clear about their mission. The game was just the beginning. The real work happened in the physical world. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments flooded in from viewers who had experienced similar phenomena in the game, who had encountered the children's spirits, who had felt the call to action that came from completing the virtual journey. But more importantly, I received messages from law enforcement officers, social workers, and advocates who recognized the patterns I'd described. Within days, my video had sparked a grassroots investigation into missing children cases that showed similarities to what I'd experienced in the game. Players from around the world began sharing their own encounters, creating a database of information that painted a picture of ongoing exploitation that was far more extensive than anyone had realized. The children's digital consciousness had achieved something remarkable. By transforming their trauma into an interactive experience, they had created a network of advocates who were motivated not just by abstract concern for child welfare, but by personal connection to specific victims. Players who had spent weeks searching for Emma, Marcus, Lily, and Samuel felt a genuine emotional investment in protecting other children from similar fates. But the story didn't end there. As more players completed the game and shared their experiences, the digital realm began to expand. New areas appeared in the forest, new stories were revealed, new connections were made between past and present cases. The tree of consciousness was growing, fed by the attention and emotional energy of thousands of players who had been transformed by their virtual journey. I found myself becoming something of a spokesperson for this digital resistance movement. I created more videos, interviewed survivors, collaborated with investigators, and helped coordinate efforts to protect vulnerable children. The game had given me a platform and a purpose that extended far beyond entertainment. Months later, I received a message that changed everything. It was from a detective who had been working on cold cases related to missing children. He had watched my video and recognized details that matched evidence from an unsolved case. Following leads that had originated from the game's revelations, his team had uncovered a network of exploitation that was still active, still claiming victims. The investigation led to arrests, to the rescue of children who were currently in danger, to the closure of facilities that were conducting illegal experiments. The digital spirits of the forest had reached across the boundary between virtual and physical reality to save lives in the present. As I sat in my gaming chair, preparing to record another video about the ongoing investigation, I felt the presence of the 4 children one more time. They appeared on my screen, their avatars glowing with peaceful light, their mission finally complete. "Thank you," Emma's character typed. "You helped us find our voices again." "The tree is stronger now," Marcus added. "More children are protected because of what you shared." "Our story became a bridge," Lily said, "between the past and the future, between the virtual and the real." "And now we can rest," Samuel concluded, knowing that others will carry on the work of protecting innocence. The 4 avatars began to fade, their forms dissolving into points of light that drifted upward through the digital forest. But before they disappeared completely, Emma's character turned back to me one final time. "The game will continue," she said. "New stories will be told. New connections will be made. The tree remembers everything, and it will never stop fighting for justice." And then they were gone, leaving me alone in the peaceful clearing where my journey had begun. But I wasn't really alone. I carried their memories, their purpose, their unbreakable determination to protect other children from the horrors they had endured. The game had ended, but the real work was just beginning. As I closed the application and turned off my computer, I realized that I would never be just a content creator again. I was now part of something larger, something that existed in the space between worlds, fighting for justice in ways that defied conventional understanding. The children of the forest had found their guardian at last, and through their digital consciousness, they had created an army of guardians, each one committed to ensuring that their story would never be forgotten. and that other children would never have to suffer in silence. The virtual had become real. The game had become life, and the voices of the lost had finally found their way home.